Today's a freakishly warm day for mid to late October. It's October 15th and it's like 74 degrees out right now in the afternoon. So today's game plan, while we still have use of outside, I have to make some cuts here on the table saw. So obviously I'm going to sand them before assembling them. So that is priority number one. I'm going to focus on that. Then if I have time, what I would like to do, because of the temperature and everything is perfect today, at the least I'm going to pull all the sideboards off and get those out here and sanded. I would like to also try to get it stained today if I have the daylight and I have the temperature to do it. It's going to be raining the next 3 or so days after, so I'm not going to have a good chance again until next week, and then I'm going to have to do the same thing where I'm disassembling the bed midweek, and I'm really trying to avoid that. So no time to waste, let's get this going.
As a preemptive spoiler alert, I did not finish all of this before it started raining, but our goal for this episode is going to be getting all of the drawers prepped and then getting all of the drawers and all the outside facing boards for the bed sanded down. The astute among you will notice that the 1x6s we have here are grouped into 4 boards, and you will also notice that a drawer has 4 different sides, so you can probably see where I'm going with this. All of these are already paired together for the boards that will be composing the same drawer on the final assembly. Just like we did when we were assembling the outside faces, first we got to figure out how these are going to be oriented, flip the boards around, see how they look in each orientation, and think about which side you're going to see the most often when it is down under the bed as a pull-out drawer. With the orientations picked, we're going to be cutting a notch into the bottom of these drawers, and that's where that bottom plywood sheet is going to sit, and that'll give it a little bit more support. Once you know what the orientation is going to be, I actually used a pencil to mark out the place we would be notching. That way I knew exactly where to notch, and I knew that it already accounted for where I wanted to orient everything. I set the depth of my table saw blade to about 1/4 of an inch so it doesn't go too deep into the wood. Keep in mind that the deeper into the wood you go, the more of a channel you have for the thing to sit, but the more fragile you make the bottom of that sideboard. This notch is going to start 1/4 inch up from one of the edges, and then it's going to end about 3/4 of an inch up from the bottom edge. And that's because we have 1/2 inch plywood, so we're cutting a 1/2 inch channel. But if your plywood is a different thickness, if your plywood is bowed, if you want to account for expansion due to humidity or temperature changes, I would leave yourself a little bit extra. Don't cut it perfectly to 1/2 inch if you have 1/2 inch plywood. Leave yourself about an extra 1/16 of an inch. But keep in mind that the scale on the side of your table saw measures from the fence to the nearest point of the blade. So that means you don't just set it at 3/4 of an inch for the second pass. You have to set it to 3/4 of an inch minus whatever the thickness of your saw blade is. So that way the far side of your saw blade only cuts as far as you actually need the channel. Because saw blades have different widths, I'm going to actually make you measure that and calculate that on your own. I'm not going to list the dimension that I used here. So I made these 2 outside cuts on all of the boards, and then I switched over to a Dado blade. Dado is spelled D-A-D-O. This is basically an adjustable width saw blade for like a table saw, specifically for cutting channels like this. If you don't have one of these blades, you can just use your normal saw blade and just incrementally cut down the whole thing to really slowly chip away the entire channel. I've got another project where I built a sunglasses shelf that I'll link below. That is what I did in that project. But after testing it on that project, I decided there's no way I can spend that much time to do all of these sideboards. So if you get a Dado blade, it will save you a lot of time. Now I set the width on the Dado blade to cut out the entire channel, leaving a little bit of room so that I wouldn't go wider than those 2 first cuts that I made. And the reason is the Dado takes out a lot of material at once, but as a result, it doesn't give you as clean of a cut. Specifically why I didn't do it is I didn't want to have a chipped edge at the bottom of the drawer that I could see when I was putting that plywood into the sideboard. So I wouldn't use that for like a finishing cut on the outside edge. But with all this in mind, I cut out all these channels, then I test fitted the plywood into every single one of these. And on some of these, I went back to my first blade. I had to widen up the channel by like 1/3 of the blade's total width just to make room because the plywood was a little bit bowed. And with all that out of the way, I was ready to get all this sanded. At this phase, we're just doing the rough sanding. So this was an 80 grit to a 120 grit to get started. These boards were extremely rough. I do not think they were meant for finish work like this. And because these are going to be touch points in the final product, you are going to want a nicer finish eventually, but because we're doing other things to the board in the future, it doesn't make sense to do all the final sanding right now. now. We still have to drill dowel holes in these. We still have to do a few other things that you'll see later on. So I didn't want to do the final sanding quite yet. This was literally just the first pass. But with that, I put in a lot more work than my camera felt like doing on this day. So let's jump to afterwards, talking about a little bit of the issues that I ran into.
Definitely ran out of daylight today, but these boards are all now sanded. I still have to pre-drill a couple of holes, and I want to go to a finer grit sandpaper before doing the final assembly. Because of how rough it was, it just took me substantially longer to sand all of those than I really anticipated. That really caused me to run out of daylight. Because of that, I didn't get to pull all the side rails off of the bed frame that's already assembled. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go take this, pull all those boards off just so they are ready to go and I can immediately pull them out. Hopefully tomorrow if it's not too rainy, and then get those sanded outdoors so I'm not generating dust in the house. If I do have the weather hold out and I can get those done, I'm also going to hit these with the finer grit at the same time. The only other issue I can think of that I'm really anticipating is when I started dry fitting these and I put the plywood in these slots that I cut out today. What I found was that the plywood along the short side is a little bit bowed, and you can kind of see that in this big piece too that I have left over. There's a bit of a bowing going from one end to the other, and because that channel is such a tight fit, it really causes that wood to bow when you try to fit it in there because it's not perfectly straight. Either way though, it's definitely going to be something I'm going to have to work around, and I'm probably going to have to play with that a little bit. But otherwise, it's already getting late. I'm going to go pull off those side rails now, and then we're going to call it a night.
A couple episodes ago, we pulled off these faces on the upper half to dowel in the portion that sits on the bottom half. We're pretty much doing the same thing here where we're leaving the screws partially in so we don't lose them and that they don't damage the floor or anything. But I'm still going to leave all of these in this bedroom overnight. That way they stay at the same humidity, they stay at the same temperature and everything that they're normally going to be at, because as I said, there was a big storm coming through. I didn't want the humidity or anything to affect the fitment of this in the end. So now that we're back at bed frame 2.0 or 1.7, I can't remember which one I decided on, let's jump to the morning where I could resume with the project.
Here we are, it is the next morning, and I have two disadvantages that I'm working with today. The first is that I was not able to beat the rain, and it was raining this morning, so it is much cooler out today. It is wet, it is miserable. And the second disadvantage is that last night I had a round of nerve block injections, and this morning I had a round of dry needling treatments. However, I am going to be combating the rain portion with this canopy that I forgot I had in the basement, but I mean, it's terrible quality and it's got a bunch of holes in it, but you know, we'll work with what we got here. So anyway, I'm gonna go get everything set up underneath this, and we're gonna continue sanding today. I don't think we're going to be staining today because of how the skies look, and humidity just really messes with the finish of the stain, and it gives it kind of a weird blotchy appearance. It just affects the final color. I'm not wild about how stain looks when you apply it in high humidity situations, but if nothing else, I'd like to at least get all the sanding done and all the dust generated outside so it's not in the house. So let's get to it.
To prioritize time, I'm doing the outside faces of the bed first. This way I can reassemble this as soon as possible so I have the most complete bed as early as I possibly can. Because this is an outside face, you can routinely touch this. This is an exposed surface. I would go a little bit more fine of a sand grit on this just to get a better end product. This is definitely one of the areas of a project where a finer grit sandpaper will make a big difference. Now, I went up to a 180 grit sandpaper, so for most people a 180 to a 220 is plenty smooth, but I am also going to be polyurethaning this, so that's going to help self-level it out a little bit more as well. And I'm also going to be sanding it between my polyurethane coats, so that way I know that I can do a better and smoother job later on. So I'm not necessarily going to a 600 grit right now because I have the opportunity to get it more fine later. But if you're not going to do a polyurethane and you're only going to stain it, get it right here because this is going to be your last chance. One other thing I mentioned in previous episodes is that I like to round the corners to get rid of all those sharp edges. That makes a huge difference on the finished product. In one of my first projects, I did not do that, and it was on a coffee table, so it's right at knee level, which this is also going to be at. And at some point or another, you are going to smash your knee into the side of that corner, so take the time to run your sander down any of those sharp corners now. Just give it the slightest bit of a bevel, and you will be thanking me later because I guarantee you it's going to save at least one of your kneecaps at some point, but more realistically, it'll probably save them both if you give it enough time. And you don't have to sit on the corner for hours. If you really want that much of a bevel, you can just get an actual router. But what I typically do is I just slowly pass left to right from one end to the other as I slowly rotate the angle of the orbital sander from one surface down to the other. Then on the corners, I do a circular motion to kind of plane it out with all three. That seems to blend it pretty well. And honestly, this is the only thing I really do to most of the edges on the projects that that I've been doing for years. It might take you 1 or 2 tries to get down, but this has given me really good results. I do want to make one quick clarification though. I did not start with a 150 or 180 grit. I started with an 80 grit to get all the really rough stuff out first, and that is going to be the best and quickest way to bevel these edges as well and get all the sharp corners off. Then I go back and I hit it with the 180 to 220 grit after it was done. But even just doing the 80 grit generates a lot of dust. So just jump into some real time here. Here is my tripod, and this is several feet away on a nice rainy day. Even so, it got this covered in dust. So the other episode where I sanded all the surfaces flush in my room, this is how much dust it generates if you don't have either a shop vac or some fans with filters going to try to catch all of that. All of this goes airborne and it will get on everything. At this point, I was happy with the sanding on all of the sideboards. I had done both the rough and the fine grit on all of them, and we had done only the rough grit on all the things for the drawers the night before, so now we were ready to pull those out and hit those with the fine grit as well. This is pretty much another rinse and repeat for all the sanding, and again, you want to break all the sharp edges that you could feasibly hit, but keep in mind that these 1x6 drawers, they have to levelly flush out against each other to make the corners. If you round off the corners of the 1x6 that are going to be touching each other, you might see a little bit of a gap there, and on one hand, it could hide any fitment issues if you're not perfect, so that's why I rounded off those corners, and I think it creates more of a rustic effect. But if you don't like that look and you want this nice, tight, even, flat corner with no gap whatsoever, then make sure you don't round off the corners that are needed to make those tight corner joints. Again, this is more a stylistic choice than anything. I think it helps hide fitment issues if you're more of a beginner, but at the minimum, I would definitely bevel the edges on the top of these drawers so that you don't skin your knuckles off when you're going down and reaching for a pair of underwear. But per usual, I make plenty of mistakes and I have no issue sharing them on the internet for some reason, so let's go into some of the problems I encountered now.
Here's an issue that I have never personally had, but I've heard a number of other people who have. So if you look at plywood, right, there's plywood, and then like this is birch plywood. It's this very thin layer right here on the top. That's the birch on both sides. The rest of it's like not birch, just whatever standard plywood, and it's just like a birch veneer on the face. So anything you get from like a big box store, so like Lowe's, Home Depot, like this stuff came from Home Depot, this veneer on the top, it's a very, very thin layer. That way they can use less of the expensive wood and they can produce more if they have the same supply amount, especially with the shortage of wood right now in COVID. That's really critical for, you know, maximizing profits. However, what it means is that this is more likely to chip because it's such a thin layer. So over here, I had just that happen. When I was sanding this edge and the bevel, it didn't take much at all. It must have caught just right and it ripped this whole thing up. And that's as far back as it went before it stopped splintering repeatedly. So that's very irritating. I think that's less likely to happen if you have like a thicker veneer, just because it's a little more rigid. Local lumber yards, I'm told, usually have better quality plywoods with the facing, especially for birch and maple. So that will be a much thicker face layer, making stuff like that less likely to happen. So my two options right now are either to recut and resand a piece like this one and replace it so that I don't have a drawer with that on the face, or try to salvage it and see if I can use it as it is. A quick check we're going to do is to see if the other face is usable and pretty, or if we're kind of SOL. So this is definitely the less pretty face. That corner's also chipped. That's not good. Unsurprisingly, in about the same area. So my guess is they didn't have the right glue or the right pressure or something right there, since it is both sides at the same point. I've also got this big old thing right in the middle. So the only other chance we have of salvaging it is if this is in a drawer where this is not a visible location. So I mean, these are, I want to say I have like 18-inch depth on these now, roughly, but I only have 16-inch drawer slides, and it's going to have this 1.5-inch board on the face, so that will be pretty far back. Even with the drawer all the way open, which I don't really intend to do, it'll only come out to about here. So I think there might be a chance that that's far enough back I won't see it, as long as I put it on like a certain side of the bed that I'm less likely to use. So I'm thinking, like, if you're looking at the foot of the bed, I sleep on the left side normally. Those are the drawers that I'm going to use more often, so most of my clothing is going to be on that side. I think the other side, if you're looking at the foot of the bed on the right side, if I can put this there, and I'm putting like sheets and stuff is what I currently have planned to put in there, you know, that's like a open it once every week or two type of thing. And even then, you're only opening this drawer if you're going specifically for the sheets that are in this drawer. So I think for that reason, and because it's raining and I don't have another day of good weather upcoming, and I'm really trying to get this done, I'm okay with leaving this. This doesn't bother me that much. And if I leave that as like the one mistake on this project, other than, you know, some of these little odd and end chip outs that I had on these sideboards, then I will be comfortable knowing that, you know, it's not perfect. And then hopefully I won't have any other major issues arise because I'm leaving this one in place. That's my mindset anyway, or if something else happens, I can say, oh, well, it already wasn't perfect, so I shouldn't beat myself up over it too much. And obviously, I always have the option to go and replace this at a later date. So we're gonna continue on with it kind of like it is for now, but either way, for now, my shoulder is absolutely killing me, so I think I have to call it quits for the day anyhow. I'm gonna get all this stuff inside, try to get through the rain against my best wishes, and then tomorrow, hopefully when my shoulder's a little bit better, that's when I'll do all the pre-drilling and stuff and try to get these drawers assembled. But hey, messiest part's done. I'm happy with that. That's good progress for today.
As I'm cleaning up here, you'll notice that I left the workbench and the canopy standing because I was planning on using them the next morning and it was still going to be rain in the forecast. But one thing I mentioned earlier in this episode is that the plywood that you're using for the base of the drawers could be bowed or bent to some degree. I think the humidity from all this rain made that problem a little bit worse and a little bit more noticeable to me while I was sanding these, so I tried to combat that by basically using a scrap 2x4 I had kicking around as an I-beam, trying to use that to straighten everything out and then clamping them all into place, and then hoping that by having it sit in this position long enough that it would potentially level itself out to be more straight again. Or worded slightly differently, I spent $120,000 on an engineering degree so that I could create crafty solutions on a woodworking project that cost me about $400. Ah yes, the great American economy and money well spent. Anyhow, I think that's going to do it for this episode. We will resume in the next morning when we are taking some of the final steps to start assembling these drawers. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next time.